The rain hammered against Lieutenant James Ramirez's broken body like enemy fire as he lay forgotten beneath a highway overpass. 3 Purple Hearts, a silver star, and now a shopping cart filled with his remaining possessions and a pair of useless legs that hadn't felt anything since Kandahar. But when a battle-scarred military dog with one eye limped from the shadows that night, neither man nor beast could have imagined how they would save each other, or the extraordinary journey that would inspire a nation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The temperature had plummeted to 28 degrees, turning the persistent drizzle into something more dangerous. Lieutenant James Ramirez could feel the cold seeping through his worn military jacket, the only remnant of his former life he refused to part with, even when the pawnshop owner had offered him enough for 3 nights in a real motel. The irony wasn't lost on him. He couldn't feel anything below his waist, yet the phantom pain from his non-existent combat boots still woke him screaming some nights. 3 years on the streets had taught him survival techniques that even Marine Force recon training hadn't covered. Newspapers stuffed between layers of clothing, the safest doorways in the financial district. Which church kitchens served meals without requiring prayers in exchange. How to secure his wheelchair to prevent theft during the precious minutes of sleep he allowed himself. Tonight, huddled beneath the Interstate 5 overpass in Seattle, James methodically arranged his meager possessions around him like a fortress. A tattered backpack containing medication he couldn't always afford to refill. A dog-eared copy of Gates of Fire he'd carried through 3 combat tours. His discharge papers in a waterproof pouch. And the letter, folded and refolded so many times the creases had begun to tear, informing him that his appeal for enhanced benefits had been denied. Again. The Veterans Affairs bureaucracy moved with glacial indifference. His medical records had been misplaced twice. Appointments scheduled 6 months out were cancelled without notice. The traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder that accompanied his spinal cord damage were deemed insufficiently service-connected, despite occurring during his final mission in Afghanistan's Korangal Valley. Rain drummed against the concrete above, creating a curtain of water at the edge of his shelter. James pulled his wheelchair closer to the wall, away from the splashing droplets. The chair, a basic model provided by the VA hospital, had seen better days. One armrest was secured with duct tape, and the right wheel made a clicking sound with each rotation. Like him, it was functional but deteriorating. He reached inside his jacket and withdrew a small metal flask, his one luxury, purchased during better times. The whiskey burned going down, a welcome heat that spread through his chest. It wasn't enough to dull the memories, but it blunted their edges, made them bearable for another night. "Happy anniversary to me," he muttered, raising the flask in a mock toast to the empty air. 3 years since the IED. 3 years since he'd lost his team. 3 years since he'd returned to a country that thanked him for his service while turning away from his suffering. His hand trembled slightly as he tucked the flask away and retrieved the letter from his pocket. He didn't need to read it again. He'd memorized every bureaucratic phrase, every clinical denial. But sometimes touching it reminded him that this nightmare was real, not just another PTSD episode. The doctors had been brutally honest after stabilizing him in Germany. The shrapnel had severed his spinal cord at T10. Complete paraplegia, no sensation or movement below the waist. "Consider yourself lucky," they'd said. "A few inches higher and you'd be looking at compromised lung function." As if the ability to breathe unassisted while homeless was some kind of victory. His parents had tried. God, they had tried. But their modest home in Arizona wasn't wheelchair accessible, and their fixed income couldn't support the modifications needed. His father's heart attack 6 months after James returned had depleted their savings. His mother's subsequent move to assisted living had closed that door permanently. The relationship that had survived 2 deployments hadn't survived his third. Melissa had waited during his rehabilitation, had even helped him navigate the initial maze of appointments and assessments. But eventually, the woman who had loved Lieutenant James Ramirez couldn't reconcile herself to the broken man who returned in his place. He didn't blame her. Some days, he could barely recognize himself. The rain intensified, driven sideways by gusting wind that penetrated his makeshift shelter. James pulled a plastic tarp tighter around his shoulders, attempting to conserve body heat. Hypothermia was a real threat. His circulation was compromised, below the injury site, making him more vulnerable to cold. Another cruel irony for a man who had survived the scorching heat of Afghanistan, only to risk freezing on American streets. He reached into his backpack and withdrew a protein bar, half his dinner. The other half he'd saved for morning. Calories had to be rationed carefully when meals weren't guaranteed. As he chewed mechanically, James stared at the rain-slicked pavement, stretching beyond his shelter. 3 homeless veterans had died on Seattle's streets last winter. He had attended their memorial service at the Veterans Center, one of the few places he still visited regularly for showers and mail. Would anyone attend his when the time came? His former team was gone, parents unable to travel, old friends scattered and lost to contact. The thought should have been depressing, but instead it brought a strange clarity. If he disappeared tonight, the world would continue uninterrupted, unburdened by his presence. The realization had been growing for weeks, a calculus of suffering versus purpose that increasingly failed to balance. What was the point of enduring another winter, another round of denied appeals, another year of pitying glances and performative gratitude from passers-by who dropped dollars in his cup but couldn't meet his eyes? James reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a bottle of pills. Painkillers prescribed for the nerve pain that still flared where his legs should feel. He'd been rationing them, saving extras from each month's supply. Now he had enough to end the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, the memories of friends blown apart while he somehow survived. His hand closed around the bottle. It would be simple, efficient, a final mission with clear parameters and a definitive end. No more fighting against a system designed to outlast his determination. No more burden on the few who still remembered him. No more nightmares of the Korengal. The decision made, James felt a peculiar peace settle over him. He opened the bottle, poured its contents into his palm. 32 small white pills, oblivion in a convenient package. He raised his hand, prepared to finish what had started with an IED on a dusty Afghan road. But before the pills reached his mouth, a sound penetrated his consciousness. Not the steady drumming of rain or the rumble of traffic overhead, but something organic. A low whine, followed by the scrabble of nails against concrete. James lowered, his hand listening. Years of combat had honed his senses, taught him to distinguish between normal environmental noise and potential threats. This was neither. It was a sound of distress, of pain, something he recognized instinctively. "Hello?" he called, his voice rough from disuse. The sound came again, closer now. A shadowy form materialized at the edge of the overpass, hesitating. At the boundary between driving rain and relative shelter, James squinted, trying to make out details in the dimness. It was a dog, large, with the unmistakable profile of a Belgian Malinois, the same breed his unit had worked with in Afghanistan. But this animal was clearly injured. It moved with a pronounced limp, keeping weight off its right front leg. As it edged closer, James could see other signs of distress. Ribs visible beneath a dull coat, a torn ear, and most strikingly, a scarred socket where its right eye should have been. "Hey there," James said softly, using the gentle tone he'd learned from the canine handlers in his unit. "You look about as rough as I feel." The dog stopped, regarding him warily with its remaining eye. Something in that gaze struck James, an intelligence and wariness that spoke of experience beyond ordinary canine existence. This wasn't a family pet that had wandered off. This animal had seen things. Slowly, James lowered the pills back into their bottle and returned it to his pocket. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the second half of his protein bar. "You hungry, boy?" he asked, holding out the food in an open palm. "I've got dinner, if you've got company." The dog hesitated, clearly calculating risk versus reward. Then, decision made, it limped forward into the shelter of the overpass. It took the offered food with surprising gentleness, consuming it in 2 quick bites before backing up slightly, maintaining a cautious distance. "Yeah, I get it," James said. "Trust issues. Can't say I blame you." As the dog settled onto the concrete a few feet away, James noticed something else, a distinctive pattern of scarring along its flank that resembled shrapnel wounds. His breath caught. This wasn't just any stray. This was a military working dog. Had to be, with those injuries, that breed, that trained behavior. "You're a long way from the sandbox, aren't you?" James whispered. The dog's ears twitched at his voice, head tilting slightly, as if evaluating his words. For the first time in months, James felt something stir within him, curiosity perhaps, or recognition. The pills in his pocket suddenly felt heavier. The plan he'd been about to execute seemed distant, as if conceived by someone else. The dog continued to watch him, its single eye reflecting the ambient light from the city beyond their shelter. "I was going to check out tonight," James found himself saying to the dog. "Punch my final ticket." "But that would be bad manners, wouldn't it, leaving you alone in this weather after you came all this way?" The dog blinked slowly, then lowered its head onto outstretched paws, still watching him. "Tell you what," James continued, surprised by how natural it felt to speak after months of near silence. "Let's make a deal. I'll wait until morning. See if things look any different in daylight. That work for you?" The dog made no response, but its presence had changed something in the atmosphere beneath the overpass. The space felt less empty, the night less final. James leaned back against the concrete wall, his hand no longer reaching for the pill bottle. Morning would come. One more morning at least, and for tonight he wasn't alone, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning light filtered through the highway supports, casting long shadows across their makeshift shelter. James awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar weight against his leg. The dog had moved closer during the night, its body now pressed against his wheelchair, providing warmth that had likely saved them both from the worst of the cold. For several minutes, James simply observed his unexpected companion. In daylight, the dog's condition was even more apparent. The missing eye was surrounded by scar tissue that pulled at the surrounding fur. Its coat, though naturally tan, was matted and dulled by dirt and neglect. What had once been a powerful, precisely honed military animal was now as broken and discarded as James himself. "Good morning," James said softly. The dog's head lifted. Immediately, alert but not startled, training remained, even when everything else had been stripped away. "Still here, huh? Thought you might have reconsidered your company choices overnight." As James reached for his backpack, his hand brushed against the pill bottle in his jacket. The resolve of the previous night had faded, though the underlying despair remained. Something about the dog's presence had disrupted his carefully constructed exit plan, not cancelled, perhaps, but postponed. "We should probably introduce ourselves properly," James continued, rummaging through his meager supplies. He found a half-empty bottle of water and poured some into the lid, placing it within the dog's reach. Lieutenant James Ramirez, Marine Force Recon, retired, more or less involuntarily. The dog approached the water cautiously before drinking, with controlled efficiency, not gulping desperately despite obvious thirst. Another sign of training. When finished, it sat back, watching James with an intensity that felt almost evaluative. "And you are?" James leaned forward, looking for any sign of identification. Military working dogs typically had tattoos inside their ears. With slow, telegraphed movements to avoid startling the animal, he reached out. The dog allowed the inspection, though its body tensed slightly. Inside the intact left ear, barely visible beneath the fur, was a series of numbers and letters. K9 M287 Echo. "Echo," James said, testing the name. The dog's ear twitched in response. "Is that you? Echo?" The dog, Echo, shifted, his posture changing subtly at the sound of his name. Not quite the enthusiastic recognition of a beloved pet, but acknowledgement. Nonetheless, "Well, Echo, I don't have much for breakfast, but we'll split what's here." James broke his last protein bar in half, offering the larger portion to the dog. As Echo accepted the food, James noticed the dog's military discipline in his controlled taking of the offered meal. No snapping or grabbing, just precision and restraint. While Echo ate, James took stock of their situation. His Social Security payment wouldn't arrive for another week. The day shelter at the Veterans Center was a mile away, manageable on a good day, but the rain had turned to a light drizzle that would make wheeling himself there a miserable experience. His chair wasn't designed for long distances in the best conditions, let alone wet ones. "What's your story, Echo?" James asked, watching the dog finish the last crumbs. "How does a military working dog end up homeless in Seattle?" "Last I checked, you guys were supposed to be adopted by your handlers or rehomed through proper channels." Echo watched him silently, the intelligence in his single eye seemingly understanding the question, even if he couldn't answer it. "Yeah, well, systems fail. People fall through cracks, even the four-legged kind, apparently." With practiced efficiency, James began his morning routine. He used wet wipes to clean his face and hands, brushed his teeth using a minimal amount of water, and checked his legs for any pressure sores or injuries he couldn't feel. The clinical detachment with which he examined his own body was a necessity. Emotional distance from his paralysis was the only way to manage the daily maintenance his condition required. Echo observed this routine with interest, particularly the careful inspection of James's unresponsive limbs. There was no pity in the dog's gaze, no discomfort, just careful assessment. It was refreshingly different from how most people reacted to his disability. "Spinal cord injury at T10, James explained, feeling oddly compelled to share with this silent witness. "IED in the Korengal Valley. I was the only survivor from our vehicle." He gestured to his legs. "Can't feel or move anything below here. Bonus features include urinary complications, blood pressure issues, and the joy of explaining to every new doctor why I can't just try harder to walk again." Echo's ear twitched, head tilting slightly as James spoke. 3 years of this, James continued, securing the brake on his wheelchair. 3 years of fighting the VA, watching my savings disappear, losing my apartment, then my storage unit, then pretty much everything except what fits in this chair and bag. He hadn't intended to share so much, especially with a dog. But there was something therapeutic about speaking the words aloud after months of silent suffering. Echo listened with a focus James hadn't experienced from another living being in a long time. "The worst part isn't the paralysis," James admitted, his voice dropping lower. "It's the isolation, the way people look through you once you're homeless, invisible except when you're inconvenient." He gestured to the wheelchair. "This I could learn to live with. Being treated like I'm already dead, that's what gets to you in the end." Echo moved then, shifting closer until he sat directly beside James's wheelchair, his body a solid presence against the metal frame. The gesture was so deliberate it couldn't be coincidence. James hesitated, then slowly lowered his hand to rest on Echo's head. The dog allowed the contact, leaning slightly into his touch. "You understand, don't you?" James whispered. "You've seen it too." The moment stretched between them, a connection that transcended species, two warriors, damaged and discarded, recognizing something in each other that the civilian world couldn't comprehend. Eventually, James straightened his shoulders. Decision made. "We need supplies, food, water, something for that leg of yours." He released the brake on his wheelchair. "The Veterans Center isn't far. They have a shower I can use, mailboxes. Maybe someone there knows something about military working dogs." Echo stood as James began to maneuver his wheelchair out from under the overpass, the dog limping alongside as if they'd been traveling together for years rather than hours. The drizzle had lightened to a fine mist, and James pulled his jacket, collar higher against the chill. "Fair warning, they might try to take you to animal control," James told Echo as they navigated the cracked sidewalk. "Not sure what the protocol is for stray military dogs, if that happens. Well, it's probably better for you anyway. Medical care, proper food, chance at adoption." Echo continued beside him, pace matched perfectly to the wheelchair's progress, seemingly unconcerned by this possibility. The journey was slow and grueling. James's arms burned with the effort of propelling himself over uneven pavement, around obstacles, up the slight inclines that most people wouldn't even notice, but represented significant challenges for a manual wheelchair. Twice they had to backtrack to find curb cuts when their path was blocked by steps. Once, James had to navigate through traffic when a parked delivery truck completely blocked the sidewalk. Through it all, Echo remained steadfastly beside him, occasionally stopping when James needed to rest, but never straying. The dog's own injury didn't seem to slow him significantly, though James noticed he favored his right front leg more pronounced, after about half a mile. "Nearly there," James encouraged, as much for himself as for Echo. The Veterans Outreach Center occupied a converted warehouse in an industrial area south of downtown. It wasn't much, a day shelter with basic services, staffed largely by volunteers, but it was one of the few places where James felt marginally human. As they approached the entrance, James felt an unexpected anxiety. He hadn't brought a dog here before. Wasn't sure about their policy, but Echo had stayed with him, had somehow prevented him from swallowing those pills the night before. James couldn't simply abandon him now. "Stay close," he murmured to Echo as he pushed through the door. The center was busy, as usual. Men and women of various ages occupied the worn furniture, some dozing, others engaged in quiet conversation. A television, mounted in one corner, played the news with the volume low. The smell of coffee and institutional cleaner hung in the air. Melissa Crawford, one of the regular volunteers, looked up from the intake desk as James entered. Her smile of recognition faltered slightly as she noticed Echo. "James," she greeted him, eyes moving between man and dog. "It's been a couple weeks. We were getting worried." "Been around," James replied noncommittally. "This is Echo. He found me last night, or I found him. Still figuring that out." Melissa's expression softened as she looked more closely at Echo, noting his condition and the military bearing that persisted despite his injuries. "He looks like he's been through a lot. Military working dog from what I can tell. Has a tattoo in his ear. K9 M287 Echo." "Really?" Melissa's interest sharpened. She had been an army medic before becoming a nurse. Belgian Malinois, right? Standard for tactical work. James nodded, wondering if there's a way to check if anyone's looking for him. And maybe get him some water, food, something for that leg. Melissa glanced toward the back office, then made a decision. "Give me a minute." And maybe wait over there? Some of the guys have issues with dogs. James understood immediately. PTSD triggers varied, and for veterans who had served in regions where wild dogs posed threats or those who had experienced attack dog training in less pleasant contexts than the US military, Echo's presence might be problematic. He wheeled himself to a quiet corner, Echo following without command. They settled there, drawing curious but largely respectful glances from the other veterans. James noticed how Echo positioned himself, alert but non-threatening, his body angled to maintain sightlines to both the room at large and James specifically. "You've got good situational awareness," James commented quietly. "Old habits, huh?" Melissa returned a few minutes later, accompanied by an older man James recognized as Dr. Winters, a retired veterinarian who volunteered at the center a few days each month. "This is interesting," Dr. Winters said without preamble, crouching carefully near Echo but not touching him. "Military working dogs are tracked extensively. If he's legitimate, someone's likely looking for him." "Can you check?" James asked. Dr. Winters nodded. "May I examine him first? That leg needs attention regardless." James looked at Echo, unsure if the dog would allow a stranger to handle him. "Echo, friend," he said, using the tone he'd heard canine handlers employ to indicate safe persons. "Let him help." To James's surprise, Echo relaxed slightly, though his gaze remained fixed on James as if seeking continued reassurance. Dr. Winters moved slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice as he began a careful examination. "Shrapnel wounds," he confirmed, examining the scars on Echo's flank. "Eye lost to trauma, not disease. Front leg has an improperly healed fracture. Malnourished, but not critically. I'd estimate he's been on his own for at least 2 months, possibly longer." "Can you help him?" James asked, surprising himself with how much the answer mattered. Dr. Winters nodded. "For today, yes. Let me get some supplies." As the veterinarian moved away, Melissa pulled a chair close to James. "How are you doing? Really?" James considered, deflecting the question as he usually did, but something about the previous night's aborted plan made honesty feel necessary. "Not great. VA denied my appeal again. Winter's coming. You know how it goes." Melissa nodded, her expression carefully neutral. She had been a volunteer long enough to recognize the signs of someone approaching their breaking point. "And now you've found Echo." "More like he found me," James corrected, watching as the dog maintained his vigilant position despite obvious fatigue. "Showed up exactly when." He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. "When you needed him," Melissa supplied, either missing or tactfully ignoring the darker implication. "Timing's interesting, I'll give you that." Dr. Winters returned, with a small medical kit and a bowl of water, which Echo accepted gratefully. While the dog drank, the veterinarian checked the identification tattoo more carefully. "This is legitimate," he confirmed. "Military working dogs have a standardized identification system. K9 is obvious. M287 is his individual service number, and Echo is his working name." He looked at James. "I can make some calls, see if I can trace where he was supposed to end up after service." James felt a conflicting surge of emotions: relief that Echo might receive proper care, and an unexpected reluctance at the thought of their paths diverging. That would be good. He deserves better than sleeping under an overpass. "So do you, Lieutenant," Dr. Winters replied quietly. "So do you." The Veterans Center grew quieter as the afternoon progressed. Many of the regular visitors departed for meal services at nearby missions or to secure sleeping spots at shelters before they filled. James remained in his corner, watching as Dr. Winters carefully cleaned and bandaged Echo's injured leg. "The fracture has healed poorly," the veterinarian explained, applying a supportive wrap. Ideally, it would be surgically repaired, but this will help stabilize it for now. He's managing the pain remarkably well. Military working dogs are trained to continue mission functions despite injury, James said, remembering the K9 handlers. In his unit discussing their partner's unusual pain tolerance. They call it drive-through pain, the ability to override discomfort when focused on an objective. Dr. Winters nodded appreciatively. Makes sense. Echo here has clearly maintained his training, despite whatever circumstances separated him from his handler. He secured the bandage and sat back on his heels. I've sent his information to a contact at the Working Dog Foundation. If he was reported missing or stolen, they'll know. The word stolen caught James's attention. You think that's what happened? It's one possibility, Dr. Winters said, packing away his supplies. These dogs are valuable, tens of thousands of dollars in training, not counting their intrinsic worth as service animals. Unfortunately, there's a black market for military-trained dogs, particularly for security companies that don't want to invest in proper training programs. James looked at Echo with new concern. The dog had settled into a sphinx position, alert but resting, his single eye occasionally scanning the room before returning to fix on James. What happens if no one's looking for him? James asked. Dr. Winters considered the question carefully. Officially, he should be processed through proper channels, evaluated for potential adoption, likely placed with a handler or family familiar with military working dogs. These animals have specific needs. They're not typical pets. The unspoken message was clear. A homeless veteran living under an overpass would not qualify as a suitable placement. James understood this perfectly, even agreed with it rationally. Echo deserved stability, proper care, regular meals, all things James couldn't provide. I'm going to shower before the facilities close, James said, changing the subject. Can you watch him for a few minutes? Dr. Winters nodded, though both men knew the request was largely ceremonial. Echo had already demonstrated his ability to remain exactly where instructed. The center's adapted bathroom facilities were basic but functional. James transferred from his wheelchair to the shower bench with practiced efficiency, the movements automatic after years of necessity. Under the hot spray, a luxury compared to wet wipe cleanings, he allowed himself to briefly consider the strange turn of events. 24 hours ago, he had been prepared to end his life. Now he found himself concerned about the future of a dog he'd just met. The irony wasn't lost on him. Somehow, Echo had interrupted not just his immediate plan, but the entire spiral of isolation that had led to it. As James dressed in the clean clothes Melissa had provided from the center's donations, he caught his reflection in the scratched metal mirror. The face that looked back was gaunt, weathered beyond its 34 years, but the eyes held something that had been absent for months, a spark of purpose, however temporary. When he returned to the main room, he found Echo exactly where he'd left him. Though the dog immediately perked up at James's approach, Melissa was waiting as well, a folder in her hands. "I have some news," she said, pulling her chair closer as James transferred back into his wheelchair. Dr. Winters's contact got back to him already. Echo's official designation was K9 M287 Echo, a multi-purpose military working dog assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group. James felt a jolt of recognition. "I worked alongside 5th Group in the Korangal." Melissa nodded. "That might explain the connection you two seem to have." According to the records, Echo was severely injured during an operation about 8 months ago, IED blast that killed his handler. He was evacuated for medical treatment, eventually transported back to the States, and was being evaluated for the military working dog adoption program. "So, how did he end up on the streets of Seattle?" James asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Melissa continued. "He was reported stolen from a training facility in Nevada 4 months ago. The working theory was that he was taken for resale. to private security contractors, but he might have escaped or been abandoned when his injuries made him less valuable. James processed this information, looking at Echo with newfound understanding. We have more in common than I thought. Don't we, boy? Both casualties of the same war, both discarded when we weren't useful anymore. Echo's ear twitched at James's voice, his focus unwavering. There's more, Melissa said, hesitation evident in her tone. The handler who was killed, Staff Sergeant Thomas Reeves. The notes say he was part of a joint operation in the Korengal Valley. Operation Hammer Strike. James felt the air leave his lungs as if he'd been physically struck. That was my last mission, the one where... He gestured to his wheelchair, words unnecessary. The IED that paralyzed you was the same one that killed Echo's handler, James finished, the pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. We were in the same convoy, different vehicles. When our Humvee hit the primary IED, the rest of the convoy stopped to render aid. That's when the secondary device detonated. James looked at Echo, truly seeing him now, not just as a stray, military dog, but as a survivor of the same moment that had altered his own life irrevocably. You were there, he said quietly. You were part of the QRF that responded when we were hit. Echo seemed to recognize something in James's tone, moving closer until his head rested lightly against James's knee. This is quite a coincidence, Dr. Winters said, having joined them in time to hear the connection revealed. I don't believe in coincidences, not anymore, James replied, his hand automatically moving to rest on Echo's head. Not after Afghanistan. Things happen for reasons we don't always understand. Melissa glanced at her watch reluctantly. The center closes in 30 minutes. Have you thought about what's next for you two? The question brought James back to their immediate reality. Echo had been reported stolen, was technically government property, and should be returned to the proper authorities. James, meanwhile, had nowhere to go except back to the underpass, no resources except a nearly empty backpack and a handful of medications. I need to make some calls, James decided. Echo needs to be properly returned and cared for. He's a war hero, not a stray. And you? Melissa pressed gently. James hesitated. The pill bottle still rested in his jacket pocket, its purpose now less certain. I'll figure something out. Always do. Dr. Winters cleared his throat. I might have a temporary solution. The Working Dog Foundation has a facility about 30 miles north of here. They've asked if we can arrange transport for Echo tomorrow morning. Since I'm heading that way already, I offered to take him. James nodded, ignoring the unexpected tightness in his chest at the thought of saying goodbye to Echo so soon. That's good. He'll be properly taken care of there. My place has a spare room, Dr. Winters continued carefully. Nothing fancy. It was originally my home office, but it's on the ground floor, has its own bathroom. You could stay tonight, help keep Echo calm, and I could drive both of you up in the morning. Might be easier on him to have a familiar presence. The offer was clearly about more than just facilitating Echo's transfer. James recognized the concern behind it, the same concern he'd seen in Melissa's eyes when he mentioned the denied appeal. They suspected how close to the edge he'd been. Perhaps they even guessed what the pill bottle in his pocket represented. Under normal circumstances, pride might have compelled James to decline. He had avoided charity whenever possible, preferring the hardship of independence to the perceived humiliation of assistance. But Echo complicated matters. The dog deserved a comfortable night before his journey, and James's presence might indeed make the transition easier. That's generous of you, James finally said, if you're sure it's not an imposition. Not at all, Dr. Winters assured him. My wife always kept the guest room ready for our children's visits. She passed 3 years ago, but I've maintained the habit. The room is available any time. The simple kindness in the offer, presented not as charity but as mutual assistance, made it easier to accept. James nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. One more night before decisions needed to be made. One more night with Echo before their paths diverged again. "Thank you," he said simply. As the center prepared to close, Melissa helped gather supplies for Echo. Some donated dog food, a makeshift leash crafted from paracord, a soft blanket that could serve as a bed. Throughout these preparations, Echo remained at James's side, occasionally pressing against the wheelchair as if to reassure himself of James's continued presence. Dr. Winters's car, an older model Subaru wagon, had been adapted with hand controls that allowed him to drive despite his own aging knees. "Arthritis," he explained as he demonstrated the system, "not as significant as your challenges, but enough to appreciate adaptive technology." James transferred to the passenger seat with practiced movements, collapsing his wheelchair with one hand as Dr. Winters stowed it in the back. Echo, upon quiet command from James, jumped into the rear seat and settled immediately, his training evident in every controlled movement. As they drove through the darkening city, James found himself studying Echo in the rearview mirror. The dog's journey from Warzone to Seattle streets remained largely a mystery, but the fact of their reunion seemed too improbable for mere chance. Had Echo somehow recognized James's scent from that fateful day in the Korengal? Was there some connection forged in that moment of shared trauma that had drawn them together years later? Dr. Winter's home proved to be a modest craftsman in a quiet neighborhood north of the city. As promised, the guest room was on the ground floor, simply furnished but scrupulously clean. The attached bathroom had basic grab bars installed, Dr. Winters explained, after his wife's illness had progressed. "Make yourselves at home," the older man said, showing James where to find fresh towels and extra blankets. "Kitchen's down the hall if you get hungry. I usually turn in early, but feel free to use whatever you need." After Dr. Winters retired, upstairs, James found himself experiencing an almost forgotten sensation, the simple comfort of four walls and a roof, freely offered without expectation. He transferred to the bed, arranging his legs with automatic care, and watched as Echo explored the room with methodical precision before finally settling on the blanket arranged on the floor. "Tomorrow, they'll take good care of you," James told him. "Proper medical attention for that leg, regular meals, maybe even placement with another handler who needs your skills." Echo watched him steadily, his single eye reflecting the soft lamplight. "You did your duty," James continued, finding it strangely easy to talk to this silent companion. "Above and beyond, surviving when others didn't, finding your way back from whatever hell they put you through after you were stolen." The parallels to his own journey hung unspoken in the air between them. Both had been injured in service. Both separated from their units, both forced to navigate a world that had little use for damaged warriors. But while Echo had somehow maintained his purpose, his discipline, his training, his drive, James had surrendered to despair. The realization was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Had he fought as hard for his own survival as this dog had for his? James reached for his backpack, withdrawing the bottle of pills that had nearly ended his life the previous night. He studied it in the lamplight, the white tablets visible through the orange plastic. "What would Staff Sergeant Reeves think," he asked softly, "if he knew his dog had more fight left than the lieutenant who survived when he didn't?" Echo lifted his head at the mention of his former handler's rank, a subtle but unmistakable recognition. James placed the pill bottle on the nightstand, no longer certain of its purpose in his life. Tomorrow would bring decisions, separations, new paths forward. But tonight, in this unexpected haven, those choices could wait. Rest "Echo," he said, turning out the light. "We both made it this far. That's something, isn't it?" In the darkness, he heard Echo shift position, moving from the blanket on the floor to a spot closer to the bed, his presence a tangible comfort in the unfamiliar room. James reached down, his hand finding the dog's head in the darkness. "Thank you," he whispered, though for what exactly he couldn't have articulated, for interrupting his suicide, for the connection to a past that, while painful, was also filled with purpose and brotherhood, for the simple act of recognition between two battle-scarred survivors. Perhaps for all of these, perhaps for something more fundamental, the reminder that even in his darkest moment, James hadn't been as alone as he'd believed. Morning arrived with gentle persistence, sunlight filtering through curtains that James had forgotten to close the night before. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't place his surroundings: the comfortable bed, the quiet room, the absence of traffic noise, and the perpetual dampness that had become his constant companions beneath the overpass. Then he felt the warm weight against his dangling hand. Echo lay beside the bed, not on the blanket that had been laid out for him, but directly on the floor where he could maintain contact with James throughout the night. The dog's eyes were already open, watching James with that same steady gaze that somehow conveyed understanding beyond species. "Morning," James said, his voice rough with sleep. "Guess we both made it another day." Echo's tail thumped once against the floor, a restrained acknowledgement. As James pushed himself upright and began his morning routine, checking his lower body for issues, massaging his legs to promote circulation, reaching for the catheter supplies he kept meticulously organized in his backpack. The dog watched with clinical interest, but no discomfort. Unlike humans who often averted their eyes from the realities of paralysis, Echo observed the necessary medical procedures with the pragmatic acceptance of a fellow warrior who understood that bodies sometimes required maintenance. "You're easy company," James commented as he finished. "No awkward questions, no pity, just practical assessment of the situation." The smell of coffee drifted down the hallway, along with the faint sounds of movement from the kitchen. Dr. Winters was already awake. James transferred to his wheelchair with practiced efficiency and made his way to the bathroom, Echo following without command. 20 minutes later, freshly showered and dressed in the clean clothes Melissa had provided from the center's donations, James wheeled into the kitchen. Dr. Winters stood at the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet. "Hope you don't mind." "Breakfast," the older man said without turning around. "I don't get many guests these days. Nice to have a reason to cook properly." "Smells incredible," James admitted. It had been months since he'd had a home-cooked meal, his diet consisting largely of food bank provisions and whatever could be prepared without cooking facilities. Echo sat at perfect attention beside James's wheelchair, his discipline holding despite the tantalizing aroma of frying bacon. Dr. Winters noticed and smiled approvingly. "Military bearing even when tempted. That's remarkable retention of training," he commented, placing several strips of bacon on a paper towel before cracking eggs into the remaining fat. "I called the Working Dog Foundation this morning. They're expecting us around 11. A handler named Martinez will meet us there. Apparently he's worked with Echo's bloodline before." James nodded, processing this information. The plan was proceeding as it should. Echo would be returned to professionals who understood his needs and capabilities. The system, which had failed James so thoroughly, might still function properly for this four-legged veteran. "There's coffee in the pot," Dr. Winters continued, gesturing with his spatula. "Mugs in the cabinet to your right." As James poured himself a cup, savoring the rich aroma of actual ground coffee rather than the instant packets available at the shelter, he noticed a newspaper on the counter, folded open to a specific article. The headline caught his attention. Immediately, "Veterans Housing Initiative faces funding shortfall." "Thought you might find that interesting," Dr. Winters said, noting James's focus on the paper. Local non-profit trying to convert an old motel into transitional housing specifically designed for disabled vets. ADA-compliant units, on-site case management, the works. Good concept, but they're struggling with the final phase of funding. James skimmed the article, recognizing the familiar pattern. Well-intentioned efforts hamstrung by bureaucracy and budget constraints. The project, called Operation Homebase, needed to secure an additional $200,000 within the next 30 days or risk losing previously committed grants and tax credits. Same old story, James commented, trying to keep the bitterness from his voice. Plenty of flag-waving and thank you for your service, but when it comes to actual housing and support... Actually, Dr. Winters interrupted, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon in front of James. This one's different. It's being led by veterans themselves, not just well-meaning civilians. The project director is a former Army Corps of Engineers officer who lost both legs in Iraq. Says here they've already secured 80% of the needed funding, and they've got commitments from local medical providers for on-site services. James continued reading as he ate, his interest genuinely piqued despite his cynicism. The article included quotes from several homeless veterans who had been involved in planning the facility, ensuring it would address actual needs rather than just looking good on paper. 20 units, all wheelchair accessible, James noted, something stirring in him that he hadn't felt in months. On-site job training program. Even a kennel facility for service animals. Martinez mentioned that when I spoke to him this morning, Dr. Winters said, setting his own plate down across from James. The Working Dog Foundation is actually partnering with Operation Homebase. They'll be providing trained service dogs for residents who qualify. Apparently, the therapeutic benefits are significant, especially for veterans with PTSD, alongside physical injuries. James glanced down at Echo, who had remained in his perfect sit position despite the food now on the table. Only the slight tilt of his head betrayed his interest in the conversation. "Echo, break!" James said instinctively, using the release. Command he'd heard K9 handlers use. Immediately, Echo relaxed his posture, though he remained close to James's chair. "You know the commands," Dr. Winters observed. "Some of them. We worked alongside K9 units occasionally. I watched how the handlers interacted with their dogs." Dr. Winters nodded thoughtfully. "That might explain part of your connection." Echo recognizes someone familiar with his protocols. He took a sip of coffee, studying James over the rim of his mug. "Martinez also mentioned they're looking for volunteer trainers to work with their service dogs. Veterans with first-hand understanding of both military working dogs and the needs of disabled service members." James caught the implication immediately. "I'm not a dog handler. No, but you have combat experience, you understand military protocols, and you've clearly established rapport with Echo despite his history of trauma." Dr. Winters kept his tone casual, as if merely making an observation rather than a suggestion. "Just something to consider. They provide training for the volunteers. Housing too, from what Martinez said." The idea was simultaneously tempting and terrifying. James had avoided any commitment since his injury, convinced that his unstable situation made reliability impossible. The thought of responsibility, of people depending on him again, sent a flutter of anxiety through his chest. "I'm not exactly in a position to volunteer for anything," James deflected, gesturing to his general situation. "Kind of focused on day-to-day survival at the moment." Dr. Winters nodded, accepting the boundary without pushing. Of course, just passing along the information. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, as James helped clear the dishes, an almost forgotten domestic normalcy. He found himself watching Echo, who had settled into a relaxed down position but maintained his vigilant awareness of the environment. The dog's discipline and purpose remained intact despite everything he had endured. His injuries hadn't diminished his essential nature, only changed how he expressed it. Was the same possible for James? The question surfaced unbidden, uncomfortable in its implications. Had he surrendered too easily to circumstance, allowed his identity to be wholly consumed by his injuries and the system's failures? "We should get going soon," Dr. Winters said, checking his watch. "Traffic heading north can be unpredictable." The journey to the Working Dog Foundation facility took just under an hour, winding through increasingly rural landscapes north of Seattle. Echo sat in the back seat, occasionally pressing his muzzle against the window to take in the changing scenery, but mostly maintaining his calm, alert posture. James found himself growing increasingly anxious as they approached their destination. The facility came into view, a modern single-story building set back from the road, surrounded by training fields and kennel structures. The sign at the entrance featured a silhouette of a working dog in profile. Northwest Working Dog Foundation. Training, rehabilitation, placement. Dr. Winters parked in a designated visitor space near the main entrance. "You ready?" he asked, and James wasn't sure if the question was directed at him or Echo. "Let's do this," James replied, beginning the process of transferring to his wheelchair. Inside, the facility was immaculately maintained, with polished concrete floors and walls displaying photographs of working dogs in various service contexts: military, police, search, and rescue. A receptionist greeted them warmly, then made a call to announce their arrival. Within minutes, a stocky man in his 40s appeared from a hallway. He wore tactical pants and a polo shirt with the Foundation's logo, a leash coiled professionally at his belt. His bearing immediately identified him as military, even without the visible USMC tattoo on his forearm. "Martinez," he introduced himself, extending a hand first to Dr. Winters, then to James. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, his eyes quickly taking in James's wheelchair without comment. "And this must be Echo." Echo had positioned himself beside James's wheelchair, maintaining perfect form despite the new environment. At the sound of his name, his ears perked forward slightly. "Remarkable," Martinez commented, observing the dog's behavior. "After everything he's been through, he's still maintaining discipline." He crouched down to Echo's level, but instead of attempting to touch him, he simply extended a closed fist at a respectful distance. "Permission to greet?" he asked, looking up at James. The question caught James off guard. "He's not my dog," he clarified. "You're clearly his person at the moment," Martinez replied matter-of-factly. "Military working dogs choose who they trust. Echo has chosen you." The simple observation carried unexpected weight. James looked down at Echo, who remained focused forward, awaiting guidance. "Echo, friend," James said softly. The dog immediately relaxed his stance slightly, moving forward to sniff Martinez's extended hand. "Beautiful," Martinez murmured, allowing Echo to complete his assessment before slowly reaching to examine the identification tattoo in his ear. "K9M287 Echo. 5th group, correct? We've been looking for you, warrior." There was genuine respect in Martinez's voice, a recognition of Echo not as property, but as a fellow veteran. He straightened up, addressing James and Dr. Winters. "Let's go to my office, where we can talk more comfortably." Martinez's office was functional but personalized with photographs of dogs he had trained and handlers he had worked with. He motioned for James to position his wheelchair across from the desk, while Dr. Winters took a chair beside him. Echo settled automatically at James's side. "First, thank you for bringing Echo in," Martinez began. "When he was reported stolen, we feared the worst. These dogs are valuable, and not everyone who acquires them has their best interests at heart." "He found me," James clarified. "Just showed up at my—" He hesitated, uncomfortable with admitting the circumstances of their meeting. Your current residence, Martinez supplied diplomatically. Dr. Winters mentioned you're navigating some housing challenges. James nodded, grateful for the tactful phrasing. Echo arrived at a critical moment, he said, leaving the full truth unspoken. I served in the Korangal when his handler was killed. Same operation, different unit. Martinez's expression shifted to one of deeper understanding. That connection isn't coincidental. These dogs are incredibly intuitive about human emotions and experiences. Echo may have recognized something in you, a familiar scent pattern associated with that mission, or simply the indicators of a fellow veteran in distress. He turned to his computer, pulling up Echo's file. According to his records, Echo suffered significant trauma in the IED blast that killed Staff Sergeant Reeves. Physical injuries, certainly, but also the canine equivalent of PTSD. He was transported back to the States for rehabilitation with the intention of eventually placing him in the adoption program for retired military working dogs. Then he was stolen, James prompted. Martinez nodded grimly. From a training facility in Nevada, we believe he was taken by someone with insider knowledge. They specifically targeted dogs with tactical training. 2 other dogs were taken the same night. What happens to him now? James asked, the question that had been weighing on him since their arrival. That's partly why I wanted to speak with you privately, Martinez replied, leaning forward. Echo has clearly bonded with you despite the brief duration of your acquaintance. That's significant, especially given his history of trauma. Normally we'd be looking at extensive rehabilitation before considering placement, but Echo's behavior with you suggests he's already found his match. James blinked, not quite processing the implication. I'm not in a position to adopt a dog, he said carefully. I don't even have stable housing. I understand your situation is challenging, Martinez acknowledged. But I'd like to propose something that might address both Echo's needs and yours. Dr. Winters mentioned you have experience with military working dogs from your service. How would you feel about entering our handler training program? It's a 12-week residential course that prepares individuals to work with service and support dogs for veterans. The offer was so unexpected that James struggled to formulate a response. I don't have any formal training, he began. Neither did most of our best handlers before they started, Martinez countered. What you have is more valuable, frontline, experience, understanding of military protocols, and an established connection with Echo. We provide housing during training, meals, a modest stipend. Upon completion, there are placement opportunities with various veterans organizations. Including Operation Home Base? James asked, remembering the article. Martinez smiled. You've heard about it? Yes, that's one possibility. They're specifically looking for trainers who understand the unique needs of disabled veterans because they've lived them. The possibility unfolded before James like a map to territory he had believed permanently closed to him. Not charity, but opportunity. Not pity, but recognition of valuable experience and perspective. Most importantly, a chance to maintain his connection with Echo while rebuilding purpose in his own life. Still, doubt lingered. What if I'm not cut out for it? What if... You take it one day at a time, Martinez interrupted gently. That's all any of us can do. I transitioned from active duty to civilian life after losing my lower leg in Fallujah. Had to relearn everything, walking, driving, purpose. Working with these dogs gave me back something I thought was gone forever. He gestured to Echo, who remained attentively positioned beside James's wheelchair. He's already chosen you as his person. The question is whether you're ready to choose him back. James looked down at Echo, meeting the dog's unwavering gaze. 24 hours ago, he'd been ready to end his life, convinced that nothing remained for him in this world. Now, through what could only be described as extraordinary circumstance, a door had opened, not to the past he had lost, but to a future he hadn't imagined possible. "I think," James said slowly, "we might be good for each other." The Northwest Working Dog Foundation's training facility sprawled across 20 acres of carefully maintained grounds. From the main administrative building, pathways led to training areas designed to simulate various environments: urban settings with stairs and doorways, rubble piles for search and rescue work, open fields for agility and obedience training. The residential quarters, a renovated farmhouse divided into efficiency apartments, stood at the eastern edge of the property, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that provided natural sound buffering from the training activities. James's new, temporary home consisted of a single room with an attached accessible bathroom. Though modest in size, the space had been thoughtfully designed for wheelchair users. Lowered countertops in the kitchenette, a roll-in shower, ample turning radius throughout. After weeks beneath an overpass, it felt like unimaginable luxury. "Standard issue for our trainees," Martinez explained, handing James a keycard. "We renovated last year specifically to accommodate veterans with mobility challenges. The program's philosophy is that experience with disability is an asset for handlers working with service dogs for disabled veterans, not an obstacle." Echo explored the apartment with methodical precision, checking corners and sightlines before settling near the bed, his position allowing monitoring of both the door and windows while maintaining proximity to James. "He's already establishing a security protocol," Martinez observed approvingly. "These behaviors are deeply ingrained. Our job isn't to train Echo. He's already highly trained. It's to help you understand his capabilities and adapt them to civilian service work." After Dr. Winters departed with promises to visit in a few weeks, Martinez helped James complete the necessary paperwork for the program. The process was remarkably streamlined compared to the bureaucratic labyrinth of VA services. Just basic personal information, medical considerations relevant to training activities, and emergency contacts. James left the latter section blank, momentarily, then reluctantly added Melissa from the Veterans Center. "Training begins tomorrow at 0800, Martinez explained, his use of military time a natural accommodation to his audience. "The first week focuses on understanding canine psychology and the specific needs of former military working dogs. You won't be the only new trainee. We have 3 others starting this cohort, all veterans, all with their own stories." That evening, alone in his new quarters with Echo resting contentedly nearby, James experienced an unfamiliar sensation: hope, tentative but persistent. The pill bottle that had been his exit strategy now sat forgotten in his backpack. In its place, a small spiral notebook provided by the Foundation contained the week's training schedule, structure, purpose, a path forward, however uncertain. "We're a long way from the overpass, Echo," James commented softly. The dog lifted, his head at the sound of his name, ears perked attentively. "Let's see where this goes." Dean. At precisely 0755 the next morning, James wheeled himself into the main training hall, where 3 other participants were already gathered near a whiteboard. Martinez nodded in acknowledgement as James found a space in the semicircle, Echo positioning himself automatically at the wheelchair's side. "Good morning," Martinez began at exactly 0800, his military punctuality evident. "Welcome to the Northwest Working Dog Foundation's Handler Training Program. Each of you brings unique experiences, both from your military service and your subsequent journeys. Those experiences are valuable assets here." He gestured to the group. "Before we begin, let's introduce ourselves. Name, service branch, and what brought you to the program? I'll start. Michael Martinez, Marine Corps, combat engineer. Lost my lower leg to an IED in Fallujah in 2007, found my way to working with service dogs during my own rehabilitation and never looked back." The woman to Martinez's left spoke next. Rebecca Simmons, Army, Military Police, served 2 tours in Afghanistan before a helicopter crash left me with a spinal cord injury at T4. Been using a service dog myself for 3 years, now want to help train them for others. James assessed her quickly. Mid-30s, athletic build, despite the wheelchair, confident posture. Her service dog, a black Labrador, maintained perfect position beside her chair, occasionally scanning the room with professional interest. Next was a tall man with a prosthetic right arm visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. Jason Burke, Navy corpsman attached to Marine units, got too close to an unexploded ordnance while treating a wounded Marine. Here because my own service dog saved me from suicide, plain and simple. Want to pay that forward. The directness of his statement created a moment of respectful silence. The yellow Labrador at his feet pressed closer to his leg, a subtle gesture of support. Finally, a compact man with visible burn scars on the left side of his face and neck. David Chen, Army, 10th Mountain Division, vehicle fire in Iraq, dealing with PTSD and chronic pain. My therapist recommended this program as part of my recovery plan. Unlike the others, Chen didn't have a dog already assigned to him. Martinez had explained to James that some trainees would be matched with dogs during the program, while others came with established partnerships. Then it was James's turn. He felt their eyes on him, not judgmental but evaluative in the way of veterans assessing a new addition to their unit. James Ramirez, Marine Force Recon, paralyzed by an IED in the Korangal Valley. Echo here found me. He hesitated, unsure how much to share about the circumstances of their meeting. Echo found me when I needed him most. We discovered he was a military working dog who served in the same operation where I was injured. His handler was killed in the same attack. Martinez nodded, acknowledging the unique connection. Each partnership here has its own origin story. What matters is where you go from here. He moved to the whiteboard, writing Working Dog Psychology 101 across the top. Let's begin with understanding the fundamental differences between how these animals perceive the world and how we do. The morning session proved intensely educational. Martinez explained the sensory experiences of working dogs, their enhanced olfactory capabilities, different visual perception, and sensitivity to human emotional states. He covered the principles of operant conditioning that formed the basis of their training, emphasizing that the Foundation's approach rejected punishment-based methods in favor of positive reinforcement. These dogs, particularly those with military or trauma backgrounds, have already experienced enough stress, Martinez explained. Our goal is to redirect their existing training into new applications while healing their psychological wounds alongside our own. Throughout the lecture, James found himself fully engaged for the first time in months. He took detailed notes, asked questions, and observed Echo's responses to various environmental stimuli with new understanding. The familiar weight of depression and hopelessness, his constant companion since his injury, receded slightly in the face of this new intellectual challenge. During the lunch break, Rebecca maneuvered her wheelchair alongside his at the outdoor picnic area that had been designed with accessible tables. "How long have you and Echo been working together?" she asked, her tone professional but friendly. 2 days, James admitted, watching as Echo maintained his position despite the tempting food smells from the facility's cafeteria. Rebecca's eyebrows rose in surprise. 2 days? That's remarkable. He's already perfectly attuned to your wheelchair movements. Most partnerships take weeks to develop that level of coordination. Martinez says it might be connected to our shared experience in Afghanistan. Same operation, different units. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. The bond between handler and dog can be profound, but there's something special about relationships, forged through shared trauma, My axle here, she patted the black lab's head, was actually donated by the family of his previous handler, a fellow MP who didn't make it home. Sometimes I think he understands my experience better than any human could. The afternoon session moved from classroom theory to practical application. Martinez led them to a training yard where various obstacles had been arranged. Different floor surfaces, narrow pathways, steps and ramps. Today we'll assess your current mobility patterns and how your dogs respond to them, he explained. This creates our baseline for training. Rebecca and Jason, you're already familiar with this process. James and David will be evaluating what works best for your specific situations. For the next 2 hours, they practiced fundamental movements, straight line, walking, turns, stops, and navigation around obstacles. James found that Echo adjusted seamlessly to the wheelchair's movements, maintaining perfect position whether James accelerated, slowed, or changed direction. He's reading micro-cues from your body language, Martinez explained, observing their progress. The subtle shifts in your upper body that telegraph your intended movements. Most handlers have to consciously train their dogs to recognize these signals, but Echo's already tuned into you. By the end of the day, James was physically exhausted, but mentally invigorated. His arms ached from propelling his wheelchair through multiple repetitions of the training course, but the pain felt productive rather than punishing. Evidence of work accomplished rather than degradation endured. When they returned to their apartment, Echo immediately went to his water bowl, drinking deeply before settling into his bed, a proper orthopedic dog bed that had been provided as part of their training supplies. James found himself watching the dog with new appreciation, seeing not just a companion, but a highly trained partner with capabilities he was only beginning to understand. The routine established quickly, mornings dedicated to theory and technical knowledge, canine health, training methodologies, the legal frameworks governing service animals, afternoons focused on practical applications, obedience work, task, training, public access skills. By the end of the first week, James had accumulated a thick binder of notes and a growing vocabulary of commands and techniques. More significantly, he had established connections with his fellow trainees. What began as professional courtesy evolved into genuine camaraderie, built on shared experiences both in service and in facing disability afterward. They began taking meals together, exchanging stories and advice, developing the kind of bond that comes naturally to those who have walked similar paths. On Friday evening, as the first week concluded, Martinez invited the trainees to an informal gathering at the main building's common room. Staff members mixed with current and former trainees, creating an atmosphere of community that James had not experienced since his unit. "Week 1 down," Jason commented, settling into a chair beside James. "What do you think so far?" James considered the question carefully. "It's more comprehensive than I expected, and more." He searched for the right word. "Healing." Jason nodded, understanding. "They don't advertise it that way, but this program is as much about rehabilitating handlers as it is about training dogs. Martinez knows what he's doing. He's been where we are." Across the room, Rebecca was engaged in animated conversation with a graduate of the program who now worked with a veterans equine therapy initiative. David, initially the most reserved of the group, was showing a staff member photographs of his family back in California. "Next week gets more interesting," Jason continued. "We start community integration exercises, taking the dogs to public spaces, navigating real-world challenges. They don't throw us into the deep end, but it definitely ramps up." The prospect would have terrified James a week earlier. The idea of venturing into crowded public spaces, managing his disability while simultaneously handling Echo, facing the stares and questions that inevitably came with both the wheelchair and the service dog. Now, though, it represented a challenge to be met rather than a threat to be avoided. Echo, "We'll handle it better than I will," James commented. "That's generally true for all of us," Jason agreed with a wry smile. "The dogs have their stuff together. We're the works in progress." Later that night, back in their apartment, James found himself doing something he hadn't done in months, making plans beyond the immediate future. He'd started a list in his notebook: skills to develop, supplies they would need, potential, paths after program completion. The very act of planning implied a future worth preparing for, a concept that had seemed foreign just days earlier. Echo lay nearby, not fully asleep but resting, his breathing steady and calm. The transformation in the dog was already visible, his coat shinier from proper nutrition, his movements more fluid as the inflammation in his injured leg responded to treatment, his general demeanor more relaxed while still maintaining his working discipline. "We're going to be okay," James told him quietly. "Not the same as before, never that, but okay in a new way." Echo's ear twitched at the sound of James's voice, a subtle acknowledgement. Between them, a partnership was forming, built on mutual need initially, but evolving into something more purposeful. Two wounded warriors finding in each other the missing pieces needed to move forward. The pills remained in James's backpack, untouched. With each passing day, they seemed more like artifacts from a different life, rather than an imminent possibility. The darkness hadn't disappeared entirely. James still woke sometimes with the weight of grief and loss pressing on his chest, still had moments when the magnitude of all he had lost threatened to overwhelm him. But now there was counterweight, purpose, connection, forward motion. 1 week into their new beginning, the overpass already felt like a more distant memory. Not forgotten, never that, but no longer the sum total of possibility. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenges, inevitable setbacks, but also perhaps a path back to something resembling wholeness. The second week of training introduced a new dimension of challenge. As Jason had predicted, community integration exercises began. Carefully structured outings designed to test and strengthen the handler-dog partnerships in real-world situations. The first excursion was scheduled for Tuesday morning, a visit to a small shopping center 15 minutes from the facility. Today's exercise focuses on basic public access skills, Martinez explained during their morning briefing. We'll be using the Foundation's van for transport. Each team will practice entering and exiting various stores, navigating aisles, and handling basic interactions with the public. The anxiety that flickered through James at this announcement was reflected on David's face as well. Rebecca and Jason, with their longer-established partnerships, appeared more confident, though not without their own healthy tension. Public reactions are one of the most challenging aspects of working with service dogs, Martinez acknowledged, reading the room accurately. You'll encounter everything from inappropriate attempts to pet your dog to uncomfortable questions about your disability. We'll discuss strategies for managing these situations, but remember, you have every legal right to be in public spaces with your service animal. The Foundation's van was fully accessible with a hydraulic lift for wheelchairs and secure locking mechanisms. As they loaded in, James noticed how Echo positioned himself precisely in relation to the wheelchair, ensuring he wasn't in the way while remaining attentive to James's needs. These small adaptations had developed naturally over their short time. Together, Echo's intelligence and training, allowing him to anticipate requirements James hadn't even articulated. The shopping center was deliberately chosen for its manageable size and relatively quiet weekday morning atmosphere. As Martinez helped James navigate the lift back to ground level, he provided last-minute guidance. Remember, this is a controlled exercise. Staff members are positioned throughout the area to assist if needed, though they won't identify themselves unless necessary. Focus on clear commands, consistent positioning, and projecting confident energy to your dog. James took a deep breath, centering himself before releasing the wheelchair's brakes. "Echo, heel!" he commanded, using the formal position command they'd been practicing. Immediately, Echo moved to his designated position beside the wheelchair, alert but calm. Their first destination was a small bookstore. The entrance featured a heavy door that would require managing both the wheelchair and Echo simultaneously. Exactly the type of practical challenge the exercise was designed to address. James approached methodically, positioning his chair at the optimal angle. "Echo, post," he directed, using the command for Echo to hold position. Then reaching for the door handle, James encountered the first unexpected difficulty. The door was heavier than anticipated, requiring both hands to manage, which left him unable to control the wheelchair temporarily. Before Martinez could step in to assist, Echo moved smoothly from his heel position, using his body to brace the door open, while James maneuvered through. The action wasn't one they had specifically trained for. It was Echo applying his intelligence to solve a problem, demonstrating the adaptive capabilities that made trained service dogs so valuable. "Outstanding," Martinez commented quietly as they entered the store. "That's initiative based on assessment of need." Echo recognized the challenge and applied his training to address it. Inside the bookstore, they practiced navigating narrow aisles, maintaining appropriate distance from shelves and displays, and handling the curious glances of other customers. Echo performed flawlessly, adjusting his position based on the available space without losing his attentiveness to James. A planned interaction occurred at the checkout counter, where a Foundation staff member posing as a clerk initiated conversation. "What a beautiful dog, can I pet him?" she asked, reaching out despite the clearly visible service vest Echo wore. James implemented the practiced response. "I'm sorry, but he's working right now. He's a service dog and needs to stay focused on his tasks." "Oh, but dogs love attention." "Just a quick pat?" the woman persisted, following the script designed to test handlers' ability to maintain boundaries. "No, thank you," James replied firmly but politely. "He's not a pet. He's a medical device that assists with my disability." The clear, confident response ended the interaction appropriately. As they exited the store, Martinez nodded approval. "Direct without being confrontational. Perfect approach." The next location presented different challenges: a small cafe with tables close together, food smells that might distract an untrained dog, and more people in a confined space. James felt his confidence growing as they navigated each new scenario, Echo responding to commands with increasing synchronization to James's needs. Halfway through their coffee order, a scheduled disruption occurred. Another customer accidentally dropped a pastry near Echo's position. Without hesitation, Echo maintained his downstay, ignoring the tempting food despite it being inches from his nose. "That's impulse control at the highest level," Martinez commented. "Many pet dogs would lunge for that pastry without thinking twice. Echo's demonstrating his ability to override instinctual responses even under direct temptation." By the end of the 2-hour exercise, James felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. The constant awareness required to manage both his own mobility needs and Echo's responses in public had demanded intense concentration, but the success of their interactions had built confidence he hadn't realized was possible. During the debriefing back at the facility, Martinez addressed each team individually, highlighting strengths and areas for development. James and Echo demonstrated exceptional natural coordination, he noted. The door-bracing behavior was particularly impressive. Echo assessed a need and applied an appropriate solution without specific command. However, James, your anxiety was visible in certain situations, which Echo picks up on. Remember that your emotional state flows directly down the leash, We'll work on techniques for managing that. The feedback was direct but constructive, acknowledging progress while identifying specific improvements to target. James found himself genuinely interested in the assessment, eager to refine their partnership, rather than defensive about the critique. That afternoon they began specialized task training, teaching specific commands and behaviors tailored to each handler's disability-related needs. For James, this included retrieval of dropped items, support during transfers from wheelchair to other surfaces, and pressure therapy for anxiety or pain episodes. Echo's background makes him particularly suited for mobility assistance and PTSD support, Martinez explained, as they worked in one of the smaller training rooms. His frame is ideal for bracing, his retrieval skills are already exceptional from his military training, and he has natural alertness to environmental changes that can help with hypervigilance management. James watched as Martinez demonstrated a bracing technique that would allow Echo to provide stable support during transfers. The dog's intelligent focus was evident. He wasn't simply following commands, but actively engaging with the purpose behind each task. He understands the why behind what we're asking, Martinez observed. That's the difference between basic obedience and true service work. Echo comprehends that his actions directly impact your safety and functionality. By the end of the day, they had established the foundation for 3 specific tasks tailored to James's needs. The process was methodical, building on Echo's existing training while reshaping it towards civilian service applications. James found himself deeply engaged in the training methodology, his analytical mind, once applied to mission planning and tactical assessments, now focused on the precise timing of rewards and the subtle nuances of command delivery. That evening, Rebecca joined James for dinner in the common area. Their wheelchairs positioned across from each other at the accessible table, they compared notes on the day's exercises, while Echo and Axel maintained their downstays nearby. "You and Echo have something special," Rebecca commented between bites of the facility's surprisingly good lasagna. "Most partnerships take months to develop the kind of coordination you've achieved in weeks." "I can't take credit for it," James replied. "Echo's exceptional training was already in place. I'm just learning to work with what he already knows." Rebecca shook her head slightly. "Don't sell yourself short. The best-trained dog in the world can't perform effectively without the right handler. You have natural instincts for this work." The compliment was unexpected, particularly coming from someone whose own partnership with her service dog was clearly advanced. James had spent so long focusing on what he had lost: physical capability, military career, sense of purpose, that recognition of retained abilities felt almost foreign. "I'm surprised by how much I'm enjoying the training," he admitted. "I thought I was just here for Echo's sake, to make sure he got proper care after everything he's been through. But it's becoming more than that." "That's how it happens," Rebecca said with understanding. "You start focusing on the dog's needs, and somewhere along the way you realize you're healing together." She gestured toward Axel, who maintained perfect position despite the tempting food smells. "After my injury, I couldn't see a way forward. Everything I had trained for, worked toward, gone in an instant. Axel gave me a reason to get up in the morning, and eventually, a new purpose." Her words resonated deeply with James's experience. The pill bottle remained untouched in his backpack, increasingly irrelevant to his daily reality. Its very presence now seemed like an artifact from a different life, a reminder of how close he had come to surrendering rather than adapting. "Martinez mentioned that Operation Homebase is sending representatives next week," Rebecca continued, changing the subject. "They're looking for handler dog teams to join their program once we complete training here." James nodded, recalling the article about the Veterans Housing Initiative. "Have you considered it?" "Definitely," Rebecca confirmed. The combination of accessible housing, meaningful work, and community of fellow veterans is exactly what I've been looking for. The wait list for accessible apartments in most cities is years long, and private rentals that accommodate both wheelchairs and service dogs are practically unicorns. The conversation shifted to practical logistics, the transition process after, program completion, housing considerations, the financial aspects of maintaining a service-dog partnership. Throughout, James found himself engaged in long-term planning for the first time since his injury, considering options and possibilities rather than merely surviving day to day. Later, during their evening routine in the apartment, James noticed a subtle but significant change in Echo's behavior. While maintaining his working discipline, the dog had begun showing more individualized personality, occasionally initiating play with a training toy, expressing preferences for certain routes during their evening campus walks, even demonstrating what James could only describe as a sense of humor when retrieving specific items. "You're becoming more than just a working dog, aren't you?" James commented as Echo delivered his slippers with an extra flourish, tossing them precisely beside the wheelchair rather than placing them directly in James's hand. Developing some style. Echo's response was a brief tail wag before resuming. His professional demeanor, just enough personality to acknowledge the observation without compromising his working focus. The balance struck James as remarkably similar to the camaraderie in his former unit. Absolute professionalism in execution of duties, coupled with the unique individual characteristics that transformed a team of soldiers into brothers in arms. That night, James wrote in the journal Martinez had encouraged all trainees to maintain, documenting not just training progress, but personal observations and reflections. His entry focused on the day's public access exercise, analyzing both the practical challenges they had navigated and his emotional responses throughout. "Echo compensates for my limitations without drawing attention to them," he wrote. "His presence transforms how people perceive disability. They see the partnership rather than just the wheelchair. Today, for the first time since my injury, I navigated public space without feeling either invisible or unwelcomely conspicuous." As he set the journal aside and prepared for sleep, James realized another change had occurred, subtle but profound. The nightmares that had plagued him since Afghanistan, vivid, traumatic replays of the IED explosion and its aftermath had decreased significantly since Echo's arrival. Whether due to the dog's calming presence, the mental fatigue of intense training, or simply the introduction of purpose back into his life, James found himself sleeping more soundly than he had in years. Echo settled into his bed beside James's, positioned to maintain sightlines to both the door and windows, a security protocol he had established from their first night together. The routine brought comfort rather than heightened vigilance, the dog's alertness allowing James to relax his own hyper-awareness of potential threats. "Good night, partner," James said quietly. Echo's ear twitched in acknowledgement, his single eye reflecting moonlight from the window before closing in contentment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new skills to master, new public environments to navigate. But for the first time in 3 years, James found himself looking forward to what came next, not with anxiety or dread, but with genuine curiosity and emerging confidence. The wheelchair remained a reality. The paralysis remained permanent, but increasingly these facts defined his circumstances rather than his identity. With Echo beside him, James was rediscovering parts of himself he had believed permanently lost in the Korangal Valley. Purpose, capability, connection, and most surprisingly, hope. 3 weeks into the training program, James faced his most significant challenge yet, The Foundation had scheduled an all-day excursion to downtown Seattle, a deliberate immersion in urban complexity designed to test each handler-dog team under sustained stress. Crowded sidewalks, public transportation, restaurant dining, and extended periods of navigation through unfamiliar environments would push their skills to new limits. James woke that morning with a heaviness in his chest he hadn't felt since arriving at the Foundation. The controlled environments of previous outings had built his confidence incrementally. But the prospect of returning to the same city where he had once lived beneath an overpass stirred complicated emotions. What if they encountered someone who recognized him from his homeless period? What if the accumulated stresses triggered a PTSD episode? What if he failed Echo after all their progress? "You're projecting anxiety," Martinez noted during their pre-excursion briefing, his observation direct but not unkind. "Echo's already picking up on it. Look at his posture." James glanced down to see Echo sitting perfectly at heel, but with subtle tension visible in his frame. Slightly elevated shoulders, more frequent environmental scans, decreased blinking. The dog was responding to James's unspoken stress, preparing for perceived threats. "Service dogs are emotional mirrors," Martinez continued, addressing the group though his message was clearly targeted. "They reflect and often amplify their handlers' emotional states. Managing your own anxiety isn't just self-care, it's essential to your dog's performance and well-being." The observation was accurate but offered no immediate solution. James implemented the calming techniques they'd practiced: controlled breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, mental grounding exercises. But the anxiety remained, perhaps even intensified by his frustration at being unable to control it. The van ride into the city passed in tense silence, at least for James. David seemed similarly withdrawn, while Rebecca and Jason engaged in casual conversation about the day's agenda. Echo remained pressed against James's leg throughout the journey, providing subtle pressure therapy without command, one of the intuitive supports he had developed as their bond strengthened. Their first destination was Pioneer Square, a historic district with cobblestone streets, narrow sidewalks, and significant pedestrian traffic. As the team unloaded from the van, Martinez provided final instructions. "We'll proceed as a group to Pike Place Market, using public transit for part of the journey. Each handler will be responsible for navigating specific segments. James, you'll lead the first leg, 3 blocks east, then north on First Avenue." The assignment of leadership responsibility, when James was already struggling with heightened anxiety, felt like a deliberate challenge. Perhaps it was. Martinez had proven adept at pushing each trainee precisely at their growth edges. "Echo, heel," James commanded, his voice steadier than his emotions as he led the group forward. The first block proceeded smoothly, Echo maintaining perfect position despite the uneven pavement and pedestrians flowing around them. James began to relax slightly, finding rhythm in the familiar commands and responses. Then came the construction zone, an unexpected obstacle narrowing the sidewalk to barely the width of a wheelchair, with temporary barriers forcing pedestrians into single file. A line formed quickly as people navigated the bottleneck, with James and Echo at the front of the group. "You can go around," a construction worker called, gesturing toward the street detour intended for able-bodied pedestrians, a route featuring a 6-inch curb with no cutout for wheelchair access. James assessed the situation quickly. "Is there a wheelchair-accessible alternative?" The worker shrugged dismissively. "Not my department. Maybe try the next block?" The casual ableism stung, but more immediately problematic was the growing line of increasingly impatient pedestrians behind them. James felt eyes on his back, heard the muffled comments, the same mix of pity and irritation he had encountered countless times since his injury. Echo sensed the mounting tension, pressing closer to the wheelchair while maintaining vigilant awareness of the surrounding crowd. His posture signaled protective alertness without aggression, a precisely calibrated response to perceived stress on his handler. James considered his options, backtracked to find an accessible route, potentially delaying the entire group. Attempt to navigate the street detour despite the curb barrier, or assert his right to proper accommodation from the construction company, likely triggering conflict with workers who clearly lacked appropriate training. Before he could decide, a businessman in an expensive suit pushed forward from the line. "Some of us have places to be," he said sharply, attempting to squeeze past the wheelchair toward the narrow passage. In doing so, he stepped directly on Echo's paw. The dog made no aggressive move. His training prevented any defensive reaction, but the small yelp of pain triggered something primal in James. 3 weeks of progress, of rebuilding confidence and purpose, momentarily evaporated. In their place surged the accumulated trauma of his post-injury experience. The medical dismissals, the bureaucratic denials, the public invisibility, the loss of dignity and agency. "Back off!" James snapped, his voice carrying the command authority of his former rank. "You just injured a service animal because you couldn't wait 30 seconds. The businessman recoiled, startled by the intensity of the response. Other pedestrians fell silent, the atmosphere shifting from irritation to uncomfortable tension. "James!" Martinez's voice came from behind, steady and grounding. "Let's pause and reassess." The simple protocol phrase, part of their training for emotionally charged situations, provided necessary structure. James took a deep breath, then another, fighting to regain his composure. "Echo. Status," he commanded softly, using their check-in protocol. The dog immediately stood for inspection, allowing James to examine the affected paw. No visible injury, no limping when Echo placed weight on it. The pain had been momentary, not lasting. The businessman, now visibly uncomfortable with the attention from other pedestrians, muttered an insincere apology before retreating to find another route. Martinez moved forward, addressing the construction worker directly. "The Americans with Disabilities Act requires you to maintain accessible pathways during construction. Where is your temporary ramp?" The worker's dismissive attitude evaporated under Martinez's authoritative tone. "I'll check with the site manager." Within minutes, a portable aluminum ramp appeared, quickly positioned to create wheelchair access to the street detour. Martinez nodded acknowledgement, then turned to James. "Do you need a moment, or are you ready to proceed?" The question offered dignity, a recognition of James's emotional response without judgment, and an opportunity to self-regulate rather than being directed. James appreciated the approach, even as he struggled to fully calm his racing heart. "I'm good to continue," he decided, though good was an overstatement. Echo had already reoriented to heel position, showing no lasting effects from the incident, but James felt shaken, angry at himself for the outburst and at the world for necessitating constant battles over basic accessibility. As they continued toward Pike Place Market, James maintained outward composure while internally processing the confrontation. The training had prepared him for public interactions, for educating civilians about service dog protocols, even for advocating for accessibility rights. But nothing had prepared him for the intensity of his emotional response when Echo was hurt. The surge of protective fury that had momentarily overwhelmed his carefully rebuilt self-control. At the market, the group stopped for a scheduled lunch break at a small cafe with outdoor seating. As the other trainees ordered and engaged in casual conversation, James sat slightly apart, still processing the morning's events. Echo maintained his working position, though James noticed subtle changes in the dog's behavior. More frequent, Check-ins, slightly closer physical proximity, occasional gentle pressure against James's leg. The dog was providing comfort without being directed to do so. Martinez joined James, coffee in hand. "Want to talk about what happened back there?" James considered deflecting, defaulting to the stoic self-containment that had characterized his military career and subsequent isolation. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. "I overreacted, lost control. Exactly what we've been training to avoid." Martinez considered this assessment. "Did you, though? You verbally confronted someone who injured your service dog through carelessness. You didn't become physically aggressive. You followed the status check protocol immediately when prompted. I'd call that a measured response given the circumstances." "It didn't feel measured," James admitted. "It felt like everything from the past 3 years came rushing back at once. All the times I was ignored or dismissed or treated like an inconvenience for existing in public space with a disability." Martinez nodded, understanding. "That reaction has a name: trigger stacking. It's when multiple stresses accumulate until a seemingly minor incident causes disproportionate response. Coming back to the city where you experienced homelessness, navigating complex urban environments, facing accessibility barriers, and then seeing Echo hurt. That's a significant stack of triggers." The framework made sense of James's experience, providing context without excusing the loss of control. "How do I prevent it from happening again?" "You don't necessarily," Martinez replied, surprising James with his candor. "Recovery isn't linear, and triggers don't disappear just because we're making progress. What you can develop is faster recognition of building pressure and more effective decompression strategies." He gestured toward Echo, who remained attentive despite the distractions of the busy market. "Notice how Echo responded to your emotional state, not by mirroring your agitation, but by providing counterbalancing calm and support. That's the partnership in action. He becomes what you need in the moment, sometimes before you know you need it." James reflected on this observation, recognizing its accuracy. Throughout the confrontation, Echo had maintained his training, despite the chaotic environment and physical pain. His stability had ultimately helped James regain his own. "The most valuable lesson from this morning isn't about avoiding emotional responses," Martinez continued. "It's about recovery time. How quickly can you return to functional equilibrium after disruption? That's the metric that matters." This perspective shift, from expecting perfect control to valuing resilient recovery, offered a more sustainable approach to managing the inevitable challenges ahead. James had been measuring himself against an impossible standard of unwavering composure rather than acknowledging the reality of trauma recovery. "I need some time to process this," James said finally. Martinez nodded. "Take what you need. The afternoon itinerary is flexible. You can rejoin the group when you're ready, or we can arrange transportation back to the facility if that's preferable." The offer of options itself represented progress, a recognition of James's agency and capacity for self-assessment that had been consistently undermined during his post-injury experiences with medical and social service systems. The choice is to make, without judgment or pressure. "I'd like to continue," James decided after reflection. "Echo deserves the chance to complete the training day, and honestly, so do I." The afternoon exercises proved less emotionally charged, but no less challenging. The group navigated public transit, practiced entering and exiting elevators, and conducted training demonstrations in a public park. Throughout, James remained hyper-aware of his emotional state, implementing regulation techniques before anxiety could escalate to overwhelming levels. By late afternoon, physical and mental fatigue began to take its toll. The sustained concentration required to manage both his mobility needs and Echo's working protocols in complex environments had depleted James's reserves. As they waited for the van at the designated pickup point, he felt the weight of exhaustion settling into his shoulders. "Rough day?" Rebecca asked, maneuvering her wheelchair alongside his in the shade of a bus shelter. "Educational," James replied with a wry smile. "That's foundation code for brutal but necessary," she translated. "We all have days like this. Last month, I completely lost it with a restaurant manager who tried to seat us in the kitchen because they didn't allow dogs in the dining room. Called him every name in the book before Martinez could intervene." The admission of similar struggle from someone as composed as Rebecca offered unexpected comfort. "How did you handle it afterward?" "Beating myself up for a while," she acknowledged. Then realizing that anger is part of the process, not a failure of recovery. Sometimes it's even appropriate. Discrimination should make us angry. The trick is channeling it productively. As the Foundation's van approached, James found himself reflecting on the day's lessons. Not just the scheduled training objectives, but the deeper insights about resilience, recovery, and the ongoing process of adaptation to life with disability. The confrontation that had seemed like a setback now appeared as a necessary, if painful, step in his journey. That evening, as the trainees gathered for their daily debriefing session, Martinez took an unexpected approach. Rather than reviewing the day chronologically, he asked each person to identify their most significant challenge and the resource, internal or external, that had helped them navigate it. When James's turn came, he spoke with candor about the construction zone confrontation, the trigger stacking effect, and his struggles with proportional response. "My resource was Echo," he concluded. "His consistent training and stability gave me something to anchor to when my own emotions were overwhelming." Martinez nodded approval. Partnership at its core is mutual support through individual challenges. Echo maintained his training when you struggled with emotional regulation. Other times, you'll compensate for his limitations or fears. That interdependence is strength, not weakness. Later, alone in their apartment, James sat on the floor beside Echo's bed, the day's experiences still processing through his system. The dog watched him with that characteristic steady gaze, present and attentive without demand. "We've both got scars," James said quietly, running his hand along the healed shrapnel wounds on Echo's flank. "Visible and invisible. But we're still here, still fighting." Echo shifted slightly, pressing his body against James's in silent affirmation. The warm weight of the dog's presence anchored James to the present moment, to the reality of survival after devastation, to the possibility of purpose reconstructed from the fragments of what had been lost. James realized with sudden clarity that he had left the pill bottle behind that morning, forgotten in his backpack rather than transferred to his jacket pocket as had been his constant habit. The oversight wasn't conscious, but its significance wasn't lost on him. Somewhere in the previous weeks, the option of surrender had faded from immediate consideration, replaced by the daily disciplines of training, partnership, and incremental progress. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with potential triggers and challenges, but for the first time since the IED had shattered his body and previous identity, James faced that uncertainty with something approaching readiness, not confidence. Exactly, too much had been lost for such simplistic optimism, but a grounded determination to continue the journey, one day at a time, with Echo steadfastly at his side. The 6th week of training brought a pivotal moment in James and Echo's journey. Representatives from Operation Homebase arrived at the Foundation for presentations and preliminary interviews with trainees approaching program completion. The Veterans Housing Initiative had progressed significantly since James first read about it in Dr. Winter's newspaper. Construction was nearly complete on the converted motel. Funding had been secured through a combination of federal grants and private donations, and they were now focused on selecting the first cohort of residents. The presentation took place in the Foundation's main conference room, with all current trainees and several staff members in attendance. Colonel Catherine Harrington, retired, the project's executive director, commanded attention immediately. A tall woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the unmistakable bearing of career military. "Operation Home Base isn't charity," she began, her tone direct and unapologetic. "It's strategic investment in valuable human capital that the system has failed to properly utilize. Each of you represents years of specialized training and experience that shouldn't be wasted, because the transition infrastructure is inadequate." This framing, focused on capability rather than need, resonated deeply with James. Throughout his post-injury experience, he had been positioned as a supplicant, expected to demonstrate sufficient need and gratitude for basic support. Harrington's approach acknowledged the value veterans brought to the table rather than just the assistance they required. "Our facility includes 20 fully accessible apartments, an on-site medical clinic staffed part-time by VA personnel, communal spaces for dining and recreation, and dedicated training areas for service animals," she continued, advancing through a slideshow of architectural renderings and construction photos. "Residents receive housing at subsidized rates based on income, with opportunities for employment within the operation." The employment component captured James's attention particularly. Harrington elaborated on positions ranging from administrative support to peer counseling to service dog training, all adapted to accommodate various disabilities, while providing meaningful work and sustainable income. "We need staff who understand both military culture and disability experience from the inside," Harrington emphasized. "Our mission extends beyond housing to comprehensive reintegration, with residents eventually transitioning to fully independent living while maintaining community connections." Following the general presentation, individual interviews were scheduled throughout the afternoon. James's appointment was set for 2:00 p.m., providing several hours of anticipation that manifested as restless energy. He and Echo completed their morning training sessions with mechanical precision, James's mind clearly elsewhere, despite his attempts at focused presence. During lunch, Martinez pulled him aside. "You seem distracted. Having second thoughts about interviewing?" James considered the question carefully. "Not second thoughts, exactly. More. Reality checks. Operation Home Base sounds ideal. Almost too ideal. In my experience, opportunities like this usually come with hidden complications." Martinez nodded, understanding. "Skepticism is healthy, especially given what you've been through with systems that promise support and fail to deliver. But Colonel Harrington has a solid reputation. Her own son lost both legs in Afghanistan, which fueled her commitment to this project after her retirement." This personal connection added context to Harrington's passionate presentation. Still, James approached the interview with cautious optimism rather than unguarded hope. Too many disappointments had taught him to verify before trusting. At precisely 2:00 p.m., James and Echo presented themselves at the temporary office space allocated to the Operation Home Base team. Harrington greeted them with military punctuality, her handshake firm and direct. "Lieutenant Ramirez," she acknowledged, her eyes taking in both James and Echo with professional assessment. "Martinez speaks highly of your partnership development. Please, come in." The interview began with standard questions about James's service history, medical needs, and experience with the Foundation's training program. Echo settled into a perfect downstay beside James's wheelchair. occasionally surveying the room, but otherwise demonstrating impeccable public behavior. "Your military record is exemplary," Harrington noted, reviewing a folder that James suspected contained more detail than he had provided on his application. "Force Recon is elite selection. Those skills, strategic assessment, adaptability under pressure, team coordination, remain valuable despite your physical injury." Again, the emphasis on retained capabilities rather than limitations struck James as refreshingly different from his typical interactions with support systems. "Tell me about your partnership with Echo," Harrington continued. "Martinez mentioned some unusual circumstances in your initial connection." James shared the condensed version of their meeting beneath the overpass, their discovery of shared service history in the Korengal, and the remarkable progress of their training together. He omitted the pills and his suicidal intentions that night, though he suspected Martinez might have communicated some version of this information already. "Extraordinary timing," Harrington commented. "Some might call it coincidence, but in my experience, these alignments rarely happen without purpose." She shifted focus abruptly. "What are your plans after completing the Foundation program?" The direct question required equally direct response. "Until recently, I didn't have long-term plans," James admitted. "My focus was survival day to day. The Foundation provided immediate structure and purpose through Echo's training, but post-program options are limited with my current resources." "Limited resources shouldn't dictate limited potential," Harrington stated firmly. "That's precisely the gap Operation Homebase aims to address. We're not just offering housing, we're creating pathways to sustainable independence." She turned her tablet toward James, displaying a floor plan of one of the studio apartments. Each unit is approximately 450 square feet with universal design features, roll-in shower, accessible kitchen, automated entry systems, basic furnishings provided, with residents able to customize within reason. Service animal accommodations, integrated throughout. The practical, tangible details made the opportunity feel more real than abstract presentation slides. James found himself visualizing daily routines in the space: morning training with Echo, meal preparation in an accessible kitchen, sleep without weather concerns or security threats. "Currently, we have 3 positions that might align with your background," Harrington continued. "Assistant to our operations manager involving scheduling, inventory management, and communication coordination. Service dog training support, working alongside our head trainer with incoming dogs and handlers, or resident services liaison, helping new residents navigate available resources and community integration." Each role offered meaningful contribution rather than tokenized make work. James considered his strengths objectively: his organizational skills from mission planning, his developing knowledge of service dog training, his first-hand experience with systems navigation after injury. "The training support position interests me most," he decided. "I've discovered unexpected aptitude in this area through working with Echo. Martinez says I have natural timing and consistency that transfer well to handler instruction." Harrington made notes on her tablet. "That aligns with his assessment. The position includes continued certification training through the Foundation, with salary commensurate with experience and increasing with additional certifications." The conversation shifted to practical logistics, move-in timelines, income verification processes, community expectations, and responsibilities. Throughout, Harrington maintained the same direct, capabilities-focused approach that had characterized her presentation. "Do you have questions for me, Lieutenant?" she asked as the interview reached its conclusion. James had prepared several, focused on determining whether Operation Homebase represented genuine opportunity or another well-intentioned but ultimately disappointing system. "What happens if funding decreases or disappears entirely?" he asked. Many veterans programs start strong, but deteriorate when initial grants expire. Fair concern, Harrington acknowledged. We've established a diversified funding model. 30% government grants, 40% private foundation support, 20% corporate partnerships, and 10% revenue-generating activities through our training programs and community services. No single funding source exceeds 15% of our total budget, protecting against catastrophic impact from any individual withdrawal. The thorough answer reflected sophisticated planning rather than hopeful aspiration. James continued with his most pressing question, what's the catch? In my experience, opportunities this comprehensive usually come with hidden obligations or limitations. Harrington's expression shifted to something resembling respect for the direct inquiry. The catch, as you put it, is mutual investment. We provide resources, structure, and opportunity. Residents commit to actively participating in their own recovery and community contribution. This isn't permanent housing or passive support. It's a transitional program designed to rebuild capability for independent living. We expect engagement, effort, and eventual graduation to self-sufficiency. The framing resonated with James's military experience. Clear expectations, mutual accountability, defined objectives. It felt more aligned with his values than the often paternalistic charity models he had encountered since his injury. One final question, James said. What happens to partnerships like Echo and me if the resident can no longer afford ongoing care for their service dog? These animals require significant resources for proper maintenance. Service animal support is built into our program model, Harrington explained. Monthly subsidies cover standard veterinary care, quality nutrition, equipment maintenance, and ongoing training support. We consider service dogs essential medical equipment, not luxury companions. Their care is factored into our core budget, not dependent on supplemental funding. As the interview concluded, Harrington extended her hand again. We'll be making initial selection decisions within 2 weeks. In the meantime, continue your training here. Martinez will provide evaluation reports to complement your application. James exited the interview with conflicted emotions. Operation Home Base represented the most promising opportunity he'd encountered since his injury. Comprehensive support without infantilization, meaningful work adapted to his capabilities, community with shared experiences. Yet years of systemic disappointment had conditioned him to expect failure, to protect himself from hope that might prove false. That evening, during their regular group dinner, conversation inevitably turned to the interviews. Rebecca had applied for the resident services liaison position, leveraging her background in military police and natural connecting abilities. Jason was considering an administrative role aligned with his medical documentation experience as a corpsman. David remained uncertain about applying, still determining whether returning to his family in California might be preferable despite fewer support services there. "What did you think of Harrington?" Rebecca asked James as they shared a table. "In the dining hall. Direct, practical, focused on capability rather than limitation," James replied, "different from most program directors I've encountered. Military efficiency with actual understanding of veterans' needs," Jason added from across the table. "Refreshing change from civilian administrators who've never served but think they understand our experiences." As the conversation continued, James found himself gradually acknowledging the possibility that Operation Home Base might represent genuine opportunity rather than inevitable disappointment. The program's design addressed the precise gaps that had contributed to his post-injury downward spiral: accessible housing, purposeful employment, community connection, and integrated support for both physical and psychological needs. Later, alone in their apartment, James sat with Echo during their evening grooming session, a routine that had evolved from basic maintenance to meaningful bonding time. As he carefully brushed the dog's coat, paying special attention to the areas around his healed injuries, James found himself voicing the thoughts he'd been processing since the interview. "It could be real, Echo," he said quietly. "Actual stability, purpose, a chance to use what we've learned to help others. But committing means being vulnerable again, risking disappointment if it falls through." Echo maintained his relaxed position, seemingly content under James's careful attention. But his eyes remained alert, tracking James's expressions as if understanding the significance of the moment. "The truth is," James continued, the private conversation allowing honesty he rarely expressed to humans, "I'm afraid to hope again. Hope is what makes disappointment devastating. Without expectations, survival is simpler, painful but straightforward." Echo shifted slightly, pressing his body more firmly against James's wheelchair in a gesture that had become their familiar communication of support. The dog's consistent presence, his unwavering partnership despite his own traumas, challenged James's protective cynicism. "You didn't give up," James observed, running his hand along Echo's scarred flank. "Missing an eye, fractures, shrapnel wounds, separated from your handler, stolen, abandoned, and you're still here, still working, still connecting. If you can maintain that resilience, maybe I owe it to both of us to try again." The conversation was one-sided in verbal terms, but Echo's attentive presence provided its own form of dialogue. The dog had demonstrated through consistent action rather than words that trauma created wounds but need not define identity or limit future purpose. That night, as James transferred from wheelchair to bed, completing his evening medical routine, with the efficiency of long practice, he made a decision. He would approach Operation Homebase not with desperate hope or protective cynicism, but with strategic engagement, clear-eyed assessment of opportunity, commitment to mutual investment, and willingness to rebuild capacity for both independence and connection. Echo settled into his bed beside James's, positioned to maintain sightlines to the door while staying within reach for nighttime support if needed. The dog's rhythmic breathing provided acoustic companionship in the darkness, a reminder of continuing life and purpose despite profound loss. Tomorrow would bring further training, more skills to master, additional challenges to navigate. But for the first time since the IED had altered his body and trajectory, James found himself oriented toward a future that contained more than mere survival, a future that might include meaningful contribution, sustainable independence, and continued partnership with the extraordinary dog who had found him at his darkest moment. The pill bottle remained in his backpack, untouched for weeks, its purpose increasingly irrelevant to his evolving reality. Perhaps soon he would dispose of it entirely, a symbolic release of the surrender it had once represented. For now, its diminishing significance was progress enough, evidence of a journey from desperation to possibility, from isolation to partnership, from merely existing to gradually reclaiming the will to truly live. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.